in the autumn of 1987 on a 12-acre vegetable farm at the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky. A 41-year-old woman named Millicent Dowe walked into the county extension office in Harlan with a hand-drawn map rolled under her arm and a question that the agent there, a man named Chester Bird, who had worked for the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service for 19 years, had never once been asked. She spread the map on his desk without asking permission. It showed her 12 acres divided into irregular sections, and along the borders of every section, running in narrow strips between the vegetable beds and the fence lines, she had drawn what looked like rows of small circles. Chester Bird leaned over the map. He was 53. He had advised 460 farms in Harlan County across 19 years. He had seen cover crop plans and rotation schedules and terrace proposals. He had never seen this. "Mrs. Dowe," he said. "Those are trees, pawpaws," she said, "and persimmons, and one strip of hazelnuts along the north fence." He looked at her. She looked back. She had the kind of face that did not waste time waiting for someone else to speak first. "You're planning to plant fruit trees inside your vegetable rows, between the rows, specifically between the winter squash strips and the bean alleys. The root profiles don't compete." "I've been reading about it." Chester Bird took off his glasses and set them on the map. He had a way of doing this when he needed a moment to decide how to tell someone something they would not want to hear. He said carefully that mixed plantings of that kind were not standard practice in the eastern Kentucky region. He said the county soil and water guidelines recommended clear-row vegetable production on slopes above 8%, and most of her acreage was above 8%. He said he would have to look into the regulatory question before he could endorse the plan. Millicent rolled the map back up. She thanked him. She drove home on Route 38, past the hardwood lots and the old mine reclamation fields and the scattered farms that had been running tobacco or nothing at all since the quota buyout in 2004, and she thought about what Chester Bird had not said, which was more informative than what he had. Let me tell you who Millicent Dowe was before she spread that map on Chester Bird's desk, because what she did on those 12 acres over the next 10 years only makes sense if you know what she came from and what she had already lost before she started. Millicent was born Millicent Sue Garland in 1946 in Pike County, Kentucky, the second of 4 children of a woman named Vesta, who kept a kitchen garden, and a man named Olin who worked the coal until the coal stopped. Olin Garland was not a farmer, but Vesta Garland was something close to one. She kept a 1/4-acre garden behind the house that produced more food than any commercial operation of the same size had a right to produce, and she did it by a method she had learned from her own mother, which was simply that you did not waste the edge of anything. You planted beans up the corn stalks. You let the squash run under both. You put the fruit trees along the south-facing fence, where the coal dust did not settle. You grew what the soil wanted to grow alongside what you needed it to grow. And if you paid attention long enough, those 2 lists became the same list. Millicent had paid attention. She had watched her mother's 1/4-acre outperform the neighbor's full-acre kitchen garden every summer of her childhood. And she had asked Vesta why, and Vesta had told her, "Because I do not ask the land to do one thing at a time. Land does not think in one thing at a time, neither should you." She married Douglas Dowe in 1969. Doug was from Leslie County, a quiet man who ran a small appliance repair shop in Harlan and who loved her without condition and without complication, which was rare enough that she had recognized it immediately and not let it go. They had 1 daughter, Joanna, born in 1971. They bought 12 acres east of town in 1978 for $14,000. A hillside property with thin topsoil on the upper slopes and surprisingly good creek-bottom ground along the lower third. And they ran a market garden on it starting in 1980, selling at the Harlan Farmers Market and to 3 restaurants in town and to a food cooperative in Whitesburg. Doug died in February of 1985. His heart stopped at 51 in the middle of a Tuesday morning while he was replacing a compressor on a refrigerator unit, yellow unit in the back of the shop. He was found by his assistant 2 hours later. Millicent was at the farm, pulling row cover off the cold frames when her neighbor came down the lane in a truck. She was 38 years old. She had a 12-acre market garden, a 14-year-old daughter, a small operating loan at the First National Bank of Harlan, and no plan, except the one she had already been building in her head for 4 years, the plan that Doug had listened to over supper. Every time she talked about it. The plan, it was a dry July, the plan she had not yet able to start because starting, it required believing that you were going to be farming that land for the next 20 years. After Doug died, she believed it. She had to. She spent 2 years running the market garden the way they had always run it. Because Joanna needed stability and the loan needed service plan, and grief is not a business plan. She sold at the farmer's market. She kept the 3 restaurant accounts. She maintained the food cooperative contract. She paid the loan down from $8,400 to $3,100 across those 2 years, working longer hours than she had ever worked with Doug because there was no longer anyone to split the work with, and because Joanna was 16 and old enough to help but young enough that Millicent did not ask her to do more than was fair for a 16-year-old to do. And in the evenings, after Joanna was doing homework or in bed, Millicent sat at the kitchen table with the books her mother had given her. Not farming manuals. Vesta had not owned farming manuals. What Vesta had owned were clippings, pamphlets, handwritten notes from conversations with other women who grew things. A slender paperback from 1962 on forest garden principles by a British horticulturist nobody had heard of in Kentucky, and a folder of letters she had exchanged with a woman in Tennessee who ran a mixed-species perennial system on hillside land, not unlike the land in Pike County. Vesta had died in 1983 and had left the folder to Millicent, and not to any of her other children, because she had known which one would know what to do with it. Millicent had read everything in the folder before Doug died. After he died, she read it again. Then she wrote 3 letters of her own. To researchers at the University of Kentucky Land Grant Program, and to a food systems nonprofit in Berea, and to a man in Ohio who had been publishing a newsletter about perennial food systems on Appalachian slopes since 1979. 2 of the 3 wrote back. The Ohio man wrote back in considerable detail. He sent her 4 research papers and a hand-annotated planting guide. He said it was a dry July. He said that what she was describing, integrating native fruit and nut species into the margins of vegetable production on sloped land, was being done in parts of Pennsylvania and North Carolina, and had been done informally by Appalachian families for 100 years before the monoculture extension model had trained it out of them. He said the data on moisture retention on sloped vegetable land with integrated tree systems was particularly strong. He said she should start with no more than 20 trees and see what the ground told her. She started with 40. She bought the stock in the spring of 1988 from a small nursery in Berea that specialized in native species. 20 pawpaw saplings on containerized rootstock, 12 American persimmon starts. and 8 hazelnut shrubs she planted as a hedge along the north fence. Total cost, $212. She put them in herself over 3 weekends in April while Joanna was at school, following the map she had drawn across the previous winter, placing each tree at the edge of a vegetable bed, where the root profile would descend into subsoil that the annual vegetables had never touched. The first person to see the plantings was her neighbor, a man named Gibbs, who ran 60 acres of hay and some beef cattle on the adjoining property, and who had made a practice for 20 years of stopping at the fence line on his way between fields to exchange brief, practical information with whoever was farming next door. Gibbs was a practical man. He was not unkind. He looked at the pawpaw starts for a moment. Then he looked at Millicent. "Those are not vegetables," Gibbs said. "No," Millicent said. "Going to be here a while." "They will. 10, 15 years if I manage them right." Gibbs took his cap off and resettled it in the way that men in Harlan County do when they are deciding whether to say the thing they are thinking. He decided, "Millicent, you are running a market garden in on hill ground with a loan on it. Pawpaws don't pay for 4 or 5 years. I know it. You're going to take the yield reduction on the vegetable beds in the meanwhile. 8% maybe. The root profiles don't compete until year 3. Gibbs looked at her for a moment. She had said 8%. With the precision of someone who had done the arithmetic before breakfast. He put his cap back on. "All right," he said. He did not agree with her. He said all right, because he recognized when a decision had already been made, and he had the wisdom not to argue with made decisions. The second person to find out was Margaret Toll, who ran the County Extension Nutrition Program out of the same building where Chester Bird had his office. Margaret was 47, a woman who had grown up in Bell County and who understood hill farming with the practicality of someone who had watched her own parents try to make it work. She heard about the plantings from Chester in the hallway, and she drove out to the farm on a Thursday afternoon in May without calling ahead. She stood at the edge of the vegetable beds and looked at the small pawpaw starts, barely 8 inches tall, almost invisible, against the upright stakes Millicent had put in to mark each one. "Chester thinks you've lost your mind," Margaret said. "I know it," Millicent said. "He didn't say it that way. He didn't have to." Margaret walked the row. She crouched at one of the starts and looked at the mulch ring Millicent had laid around the base. Good mulch, 2 inches of wood chip over shredded leaf. She had done this herself, every tree, 40 times. "What are you expecting in year 5? Margaret asked. Millicent told her. She had the numbers ready, because the numbers were always ready. She quoted the Ohio newsletter, the Kentucky data on pawpaw market pricing, the projection she had run herself 3 different ways across 2 winters. Margaret listened without interrupting, which not everyone did. When Millicent was done, Margaret stood up and brushed the dirt off her knee. "Chester is going to keep saying you don't meet the slope management guidelines." "He will. There isn't anything I can do about Chester. I'm not asking you to do anything about Chester." Margaret nodded. She drove back to town. She did not, in the following weeks, stop talking to Chester Bird about the Dowe farm. But she also did not stop coming out on Thursday afternoons to check how the plantings were coming in. The opposition arrived in waves, the way opposition always does in small counties where everyone has known everyone for 40 years and disagreement travels the same roads as the mail. The first wave was informal. It was the conversation at the Harlan Diner on Main Street, the kind of conversation that happens between 6 and 8 in the morning, when the same 6-8 in the morning, when the same four tables, breakfast at the same 4 tables for 20 years. And a new topic is a relief from the old ones. The topic was the Dowe widow and her fruit trees in the vegetable beds. The tone was not cruel. It was the tone that small communities use for people who are doing something unusual that will probably not work. A kind of preemptive sympathy, the soft shaking of heads that says we see what is coming, and we are sorry in advance. The second wave was the bank. Her operating loan officer, at First National, was a man named Albert Pryor, 44 years old, who had taken over the account after Doug died, and who ran his loan portfolio with a system he had learned from his predecessor, which was that Harlan County agricultural loans were collateralized against yield projections, and yield projections were based on historical production. By crop type, and pawpaws had no historical production in his ledgers because nobody in Harlan County had ever grown pawpaws commercially. He called Millicent in March of 1989 to discuss the renewal of her operating note. She brought her map, she brought her projections, she brought the Ohio newsletter, and the research papers from the University of Kentucky, and a letter from the Food Cooperative in Whitesburg that stated in writing their interest in purchasing native fruit at specified prices once production reached a minimum annual volume. Albert Pryor looked at the letter. He looked at the research papers. He approved the note. He told her, carefully, that the bank would be monitoring the operation closely, and that any further deviation from standard row crop and vegetable production practice would need to be disclosed to the lending officer at renewal. She asked him what he meant by deviation. He could not answer that precisely. She waited while he did not answer. Then she thanked him and took her papers and went home. She was 42 years old. In the spring of 1989, she had been farming alone for 4 years. Joanna had graduated from Harlan High in 1989 and was at Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond on a partial scholarship and working 20 hours a week to cover the rest. Millicent had made sure of that. The farm had made sure of that. The third wave was the one she had not fully anticipated. It came from inside the family. Her brother-in-law, a man named Curtis Dowe, was Doug's older brother by 6 years, a retired mine foreman who lived in Lynch and who had always understood the Dowe property to be something that would eventually return to the Dowe family in some form. He had not said this directly when Doug died. He had said it indirectly in the way that family members say things they believe without quite wanting to be accountable for believing them. In the form of concern, in the form of suggestions about what Doug would have wanted, in the form of phone calls to Joanna at college asking how her mother was really doing. Curtis came to the farm in the summer of 1990. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said that he had been hearing things in town and that he was worried about Millicent's situation. "What have you been hearing?" Millicent said. "That the trees are taking up bed space that they could be producing. They are taking up edge space. The beds are producing at 93% of the 1985 yield. I have the numbers if you'd like them." Curtis put down his cup. He had the Dowe family's way of going quiet when he did not know how to proceed, the same way Doug had gone quiet. But in Doug, the quiet had been thoughtful, and in Curtis, it was something closer to recalculation. "Millicent," he said, "if this place gets into trouble, I want you to know that the family would want to help. The land should stay in family hands." She looked at him across the kitchen table for a moment. "Curtis," she said, "this place is not going to get into trouble." She said it the way you say something when you have already seen the end of the road and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Curtis did not hear that. He heard what he wanted to hear, which was a woman who was managing as well as could be expected, which was not well enough, which would eventually require the intervention he was already planning. He drove home to Lynch. He mentioned his concerns at the next family gathering. The family gathered its concerns around the story like water, finding a low place. And the story that settled at the bottom, was that Millicent Dowe was running the farm into something none of them could name, but all of them could feel, the way you feel weather coming before you can see it. The pawpaws set their first fruit in 1991. It was a small crop, perhaps 30 pounds total, across the 20 trees that had fruited, which was less than half the planting. Millicent picked everyone by hand. She took them to the farmer's market in a single flat. She sold them in 40 minutes at $3 a pound, which was twice what she charged for her best tomatoes. She made a note in her ledger, 30 pounds, $90, 40 minutes. Then she went home and wrote a long letter to the man in Ohio. The corn the neighbor grew on the adjacent flat ground that year had yielded 110 bushels per acre, which was average. Millicent's vegetable beds had yielded 94% of their 1985 production levels, almost exactly what she had projected. The yield reduction from the tree establishment had been 6%, slightly better than the 8% she had told Gibbs. She wrote that number in the ledger too. She did not tell anyone at the diner. She did not mention it to Chester Bird. She paid the operating note in November and put $2,800 into a savings account at a credit union in Whitesburg, not the bank in Harlan. The years from 1991 to 1994 were years of quiet accumulation. The pawpaws grew. The persimmons began establishing the deep root systems that would, by 1995, be drawing moisture from 20 inches below where the vegetable roots stopped. Millicent expanded the planting in 1992, adding 12 more pawpaws and a row of elderberry along the creek bottom margin. Total trees and shrubs by the end of 1993, 61. Total investment in plant material across 5 years, $487. Chester Bird came out to the farm in the spring of 1993. He came officially with a clipboard as part of a routine conservation compliance check that his office ran on farms receiving cost-share funding. Millicent received cost-share on 2 contour strips she had installed in 1986 for erosion control on the upper slope. He walked the contour strips. He checked his boxes. Then he walked the edge of the vegetable beds and looked at the trees, which were now 8 and 9 feet tall. The pawpaws leafed out in the early June warmth, the persimmons still holding their buds. He stood for a long time without saying anything. "Mrs. Dowe," he said, "these are considerably larger than I expected." "They have been growing for 5 years," she said. He wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at the tree canopy and at the vegetable beds running under and beside it, and at the way the soil color changed visibly in the alleys under the canopy, darker and more moisture retentive even in a dry spring. "The soil structure here," he said. He did not finish the sentence. "The root systems have been building organic matter for 5 years, she said. "I can show you the soil samples if you'd like. I've been pulling them every October." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'd like to see the samples," he said. She showed him. She had kept every sample result going back to 1986, organized by bed section and by year, with hand-drawn graphs tracking organic matter percentage, water-holding capacity, and compaction resistance. The soil in the tree alleys had improved measurably every year since 1990. The soil in the open vegetable beds had held steady. The soil in the alleys was now better than the open beds by every measure she tracked. Chester Bird sat at the kitchen table with the folder for 40 minutes. When he left, he did not say anything about the cost-share compliance. Said he would be in touch. He drove back to his office and he sat at his desk, and he did not do any of the other paperwork he had planned to do that afternoon. He stared at the wall. He had been telling people for 5 years, quietly and not unkindly, that Millicent Dowe was a good gardener doing something that the land was not suited for. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in a specific way that his 19 years of extension work had not prepared him to be wrong, which was that a farmer had shown him data that contradicted the standard model, and he had no framework for processing it except to sit with it until a framework arrived. The framework arrived slowly. It took 2 years. The summer of 1995 was the summer everything changed, though not in the way that anyone standing outside the story would have predicted. The spring had been dry, the driest in Harlan County since 1977. The creek-bottom ground came in reasonable. The upland ground did not. The established vegetable farmers in the county who relied on slope ground were hauling water by July. The county reported a 22% reduction in market garden output at the August farmers market compared to the 5-year average. Millicent's beds came in at 91% of her 5-year average. The tree alleys had been moderating soil moisture since 1993, pulling groundwater from below the vegetable root zone and releasing it through nighttime transpiration into the air column directly above the beds. It was not a miracle. It was 8 years of root systems doing what root systems do when you give them enough time and stop tilling them out. The pawpaw crop in 1995 was 340 pounds. The persimmons added another 90 pounds. The elderberries produced their first harvestable quantity. She had 4 buyers by that year. The farmers market, the food cooperative in Whitesburg, a new natural food store in Middlesboro, and a woman in Pineville who ran a cottage jam operation and who had heard about the persimmons from a customer at the Whitesburg cooperative and had driven to the farm one morning in September and stood in the lane and asked if she could buy everything. Millicent didn't already have committed. Her name was Gretchen Slade. She was 31, and she was the best thing that happened to the farm between 1988 and 1998, because what Gretchen Slade had that Millicent did not yet have was a direct consumer market and no patience for wholesale pricing. Gretchen bought persimmons at $4.50 a pound and pawpaws at $5. She made them into preserves that she sold at 3 regional craft fairs and by mail order to a list of 212 households she had built herself over 4 years. She moved Millicent's fruit at a price that no packing house would have approached, and she did it without any overhead that Millicent had to carry. The net income from the tree crops in 1995 was $2,100. The combined income from vegetables and tree crops was the highest gross the farm had produced in any year, including the years when Doug was alive. Millicent did not advertise this. She wrote the number in the ledger, and she called the Ohio man, and she went to bed. Chester Bird stopped by the farm in October of 1995. He was not on official business. He brought a bag of apples from his wife's tree as a kind of offering and stood at the kitchen door until she invited him in. He said he had been thinking about the soil samples for 2 years. She poured coffee. She waited. "Mrs. Dowe," Chester said, "I want to tell you that I have not given you the support I should have when you first came in with that map." "I know it," she said. "I told you the slope guidelines were a problem. They were not a problem for what you were doing. What you were doing was closer to erosion control than to orchard establishment, and the slope guidelines don't apply to conservation plantings." I knew that. I chose not to see it. She looked at him across the table for a moment. You're seeing it now," she said. "Better late than not," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He asked if he could bring 2 of the county's newer extension agents out to walk the beds in the spring. She said yes. He came in April with 2 young women who had graduated from UK in the previous 3 years and who walked the alleys with their notebooks out and crouched at the soil and asked better questions than Chester had asked in 1988. Millicent answered everyone. She spent 4 hours with them. One of them, a woman from Letcher County named Alice, came back on her own time in July with her own soil testing kit and spent a Saturday morning taking samples she said were for a paper she was writing. The paper was published in the Kentucky Extension Agricultural Journal in 1997. It cited the Dowe farm by name. The citation was 6 lines of a 12-page paper, and it changed nothing immediately. But it was a record, which was more than nothing. The bad year came in 1997, not a drought year, a market year. The food cooperative in Whitesburg restructured its produce purchasing and cut its per-item pricing by 18% across the board in response to competition from a regional natural grocery chain that had opened a store in Hazard. 3 of Millicent's 5 accounts reduced their orders. The farmers market, which had never been her highest margin channel, was now doing more work than it had capacity for. She had a good crop and a thinning margin and an operating note that had crept back up to $5,600 because she had expanded the planting in 1996 on borrowed money. She did not panic. She went through the ledger, and she found every number that could be reconsidered. She called Gretchen Slade and asked if Gretchen could absorb more volume. Gretchen said she could absorb the entire persimmon crop if Millicent could hold it in cold storage until November, when the mail order season peaked. Millicent built a cold storage room in the barn over the course of 2 weekends, using second-hand refrigeration components she bought from a restaurant equipment dealer in Knoxville. She put $1,500 into it. It held the persimmons from October to Thanksgiving. The November pricing was 30% higher than the September pricing. She cleared the note by December. She was 50 years old in 1997. Joanna had finished her degree at Eastern and come home for a summer and gone to Lexington for a job with a state agricultural nonprofit and was sending $100 home most months, which Millicent accepted without comment and put in the credit union account, which was by then $14,200. The summer of 1999 was the summer the drought came. Not the soft, dry spring of 1995, but a true drought, the kind that Harlan County had not seen since the 1950s, the kind that breaks things. The creek fell by late June. The upland fields across the county went to dust by the 3rd week of July. The Harlan County Agricultural Report for 1999 would later show an average vegetable farm yield reduction of 38%. Millicent's beds came in at 79% of her 5-year average, which was a real reduction. She was not untouched, but the tree alleys were now in their 12th year. The root systems of the pawpaws and the persimmons extended past 30 inches in some positions. The nighttime transpiration effect was measurable across the full width of every bed that ran adjacent to an established tree. The soil moisture at 6 inches in the alleys was reading 30% higher than in the uncovered market gardens at the county's comparison plots, a number that Alice from Letcher County had been tracking since 1996. The pawpaw crop in 1999 was the largest the planting had ever produced, 470 pounds. The persimmons added 180, the elderberries added 60. Gretchen Slade took everything she could sell. The cold storage room held everything Gretchen could not sell immediately. The combined gross from the Dowe farm in 1999 was $41,000, against an average Harlan County market garden gross of $14,000 for comparable acreage. Curtis Dowe came to see her that December. He had heard the number, which had made its way through the county, the way most numbers do, which is to say, imprecisely and somewhat larger than it was, and mixed in with opinions. He came alone. He sat at the kitchen table, where he had sat in 1990, and he could not look at her at first. "Millicent," he said, "I have been wrong about this farm for a long time." She poured him coffee. She sat. "I said things to Joanna at school. Things that were not helpful. I know you did. I thought the trees were going to finish you. I know you did." He wrapped his hands around the cup. He was 67 years old. He had retired from the in 1994. He was not a bad man. He had been a man who believed what the county believed and had not been curious enough to look past the edge of what he believed. "I don't know what to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything, Curtis." "Doug would have understood this," he said. "He would have been proud." She looked out the window at the farm. In December, the bare pawpaw branches in the near field, the persimmon trees holding their last dried fruit against the gray sky. "He knew about the plan," she said. "I told him every time I thought about it." He listened. Curtis nodded. He stayed for an hour. He came back the following spring with his grandson, a 12-year-old boy who had expressed an interest in growing things. Millicent walked the boy through the alleys and explained the root profiles and the soil layers, and showed him the October soil samples going back to 1986. The boy asked good questions. She answered every one. In the spring of 2001, the Harlan County Cooperative Extension Service invited Millicent Dowe to speak at the annual Eastern Kentucky Farm Resilience Conference in Hazard. Chester Bird had retired the year before. The invitation came from Alice, who was now the district's senior soil health specialist, and who had been writing about the Dowe Farm's moisture data for 4 years in various extension publications. Millicent almost said no. Joanna told her she could not say no. She stood at a folding table in a conference room at a Holiday Inn in Hazard, with 63 extension agents and farmers sitting in plastic chairs in front of her. She had one index card. She looked at it once. She put it in her pocket. "Everybody in this room knows what happened to Harlan County in 1999, she said. "The question I want to ask is why some farms came through it and some didn't. And the answer I'm going to give you is not about seed selection or irrigation systems or crop insurance. The answer is about time, specifically about root time, specifically about what your ground can hold after 12 years of a root system you never tilled out." She paused. The room was quiet. "My mother grew 6 things on a 1/4 acre in Pike County and outproduced every kitchen garden in her township for 40 years. She was not smarter than her neighbors. She was not smarter than her neighbors. She was willing to wait. She planted the pawpaw trees the year she moved in, and she picked the fruit for 30 years, and she told me, 'You do not plant for this season. You plant for the season that's coming, when you're too old to plant anything new.'" She paused again. "The extension model for 50 years has been annual production, annual inputs, annual returns. I understand why. It's easier to lend against. It's easier to insure. It's easier to report. But it's not how the land actually works, and it's not how the farmers who survived 1999 in this county were farming. The farmers who survived 1999 were the farmers who had something in on the ground that was older than the drought." She stepped back. The room stayed quiet for a moment, and then it was not. Alice was in the front row. Chester Bird was not there. He had retired to Berea and was tending a garden of his own. But he had heard about the conference, and he had sent a letter with Alice to give to Millicent, a letter that said he had been thinking about that map for 14 years, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to say so. Millicent read the letter in her car after the conference. She sat in the parking lot for a while. Joanna came home in 2003 to take over the farm's production planning. Her husband followed in 2004. They had 2 children who grew up walking the alleys between the pawpaw trees, which were now 15 and 16 years old, and which required specific management knowledge that only 2 people in Harlan County possessed, and one of them was Millicent, and the other was Joanna, who had learned it from her mother, and from the man in Ohio, and from Alice's soil reports. The cold storage room had been expanded twice. The farm was selling into 11 accounts by 2005. Gretchen Slade's mail order list had grown to 840 households across 9 states. In 2010, the farm was assessed at a value 3 times its 1988 value, against an average Harlan County farm. Appreciation of less than half that. Chester Bird drove out from Berea on a Saturday in October of that year. He was 73. He walked the alleys with Millicent in the cool, dry air of an eastern Kentucky fall, the pawpaw trees dropping their last leaves around them, the persimmons holding their orange fruit against the sky. "What do you see?" Millicent asked him. He looked at the alleys. He looked at the vegetable beds that had been running in the same ground since 1980. He looked at the soil color, still visibly darker in the alley margins than anywhere else in the county. "I see what your mother knew," he said. "I see 12 acres that are producing what the land can actually produce, which is more than one thing at a time, and more this year than last year, because it was more last year than the year before." He did not say anything else for a while. They walked the lower rows. The creek was running clear and low in the October quiet. "I should have read that map in 1988, he said. "You read it in the end," she said. 14 years late. "Chester," she said, "some people never read it." He nodded. He stayed for lunch. He drove back to Berea in the afternoon. He died 3 years later, in 2013, in the house in Berea, with his wife beside him and his own small garden outside the window, a garden that by then included 4 pawpaw trees he had planted in 2001 along the back fence, which were, by the time he died, beginning to produce their first fruit. Millicent Dowe still walks the alleys when the weather is good. She is 78 years old. The farm is managed by Joanna and her husband, with the 2 children taking on more each season. The trees that Millicent planted in the spring of 1988 for $212 are now 27 years old. They will live for another 50 if the family tends them. The combined operation in the years since 2005 has not fallen below 3 times the county average for comparable acreage in any growing season, including the 2 dry summers of 2007 and 2012. What Vesta Garland taught a girl in Pike County in the 1950s, walking through a quarter-acre garden in the long light of a Kentucky summer evening, was not a farming method. It was a way of seeing. It was the understanding that land does not work in single lines and single seasons, that it works in layers and in decades, and that the farmer who asks only what this season will return has already decided, without knowing it, to farm a smaller version of the farm than actually exists. Millicent Dowe planted 40 fruit trees in a vegetable farm in the spring of 1988 and was told for 7 years by every credentialed person in Harlan County that the land was not suited for it. She paid her loan every November of those 7 years. She kept her soil samples in a folder, organized by year. She answered letters from young farmers late at night at the kitchen table after the farm work was done. She survived a drought that reduced her yield by 21%, while it reduced neighbors by 38%. Not because she was lucky, but because she had 12 years of roots in the ground, doing work that no one standing above the ground could see. $212 in native fruit stock, a hand-drawn map, a folder of clippings from a woman who grew up knowing that no acre should ever be asked to do only one thing. That is what it cost to outlast every person who laughed.